Welcome back to this masterclass from the European Open Source Academy. In these sessions, we have been looking at building and sustaining open source impact. My name is Amandine Le Pape, and I am walking you through how open source business owners and corporate users can drive the change. We have got to lesson 2, which is going to present the foundational elements for the success of an open source business. We've already gone through a bit of background on the story of Matrix and Element and my experience in the domain, and also recognizing the open source opportunity. Open source is powerful, and there are many ways of implementing it which may or may not lead to success. So let's go for a quick overview of some of the key decisions that needs to be made to ensure that the project and your business starts from the right foot. You need to build on strong foundation if you want to go far. So from voicing the clear objectives of what you are trying to do, to avoiding the trap of open washing, via the analysis of the actual cost of building open source, then hopefully with all this you should be set. Let's start from the beginning. We've been talking a lot about open source since the beginning of this session, but what is open source? The definition of open source may be taken at face value, and if you look into the dictionary, it will tell you something along the lines of it's software or hardware for which the original source code or design is made freely available and may be redistributed and modified. However, if one looks at the definition from the open source initiative, we will find that open source is not just about being source available, but it's also about defining user freedoms. It goes much further than just the availability of source code or designs. So let's look at the definition from the open source initiative. We've tried to summarize it here because it's pretty long and there are many bullet points. But in short, there are basically 5 angles which are really important. The first one is the free redistribution. So the license must allow software or hardware to be given away or sold without requiring a royalty or a fee. The second angle is that the source code should be available. So the program, if we're talking about software, and I'm not going to repeat software and hardware every time, so I may just summarize that software, but it's valid for hardware too. The program must include source code, allow the distribution in both source and compiled forms, and not permit the obfuscated source as a disguise. The third one is that it should allow derivative works. So the modifications and the derivative works must be allowed, but they must be redistributable under the same license as the original. The fourth one is around the lack of discrimination and the license uniformity. The licenses should not be discriminating against persons, groups, or fields or endeavor, and the rights must be applied uniformly to all the recipients without extra licensing steps. And the last one is around the neutrality and the fact that terms needs to be non-restrictive. So the licenses must not be specific to a given product, given technology, or restrict other software distributed alongside, and they must be technology neutral again. So that's a lot, and as we've seen, the simple angle is, yeah, of course, just the code should be available, but it goes much beyond that. In the end, that's a kind of one definition. It's pretty wide, and inside there is a whole range of permission. So the world of open source license is very busy. There are many of them. There are more than like several hundred licenses out there, but they're not all equal. And even the subset, which is officially approved by the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, is only limited to 80 to 90 licenses, depending on the year, because some of new licenses are coming up, some old ones are being removed, etc., etc. But overall, we can look at them as split between 2 main groups, a group of copyleft licenses and permissive licenses. And a copyleft license means that anyone has the right to use, modify, or share the work as long as it is open source. So the original author can claim copyright on the work if it is not open source. if this, whether this applies to all the code or just a modification that they've made, the end user has made on the code, depends on the type of license. So overall, you have an open source product, software. You want to make change with a copyleft license. You want to make change to it. Either you need to publish it under the same license as it was originally, or if you don't want to and you want to keep it proprietary, you will have to, the copyright of the original code will still belong to the original author, and there may be a fee to be paid, a royalty to be paid to this author. So open source versus source available. It's very tempting to say a software is open source just because you've made the source available out there in GitHub. But the user's rights and freedoms are the critical aspect to open source. And the right to expand and redistribute without fee is really what provides the actual sovereignty. So you can think of it as a bit of a right ratchet, which ranges from the most permissive to the most restrictive, and where the open source definition draws the line in the sand. So that there is a point where the OSI will say, beyond that level of restriction, we don't consider this open source anymore. And basically, as an open source business, you need to find the right equilibrium point depending on your business model, depending on what you're trying to achieve, who you're talking to, who you're going to sell to, etc., etc. We'll get into that in a second. But basically, looking at this list of different licenses, then you need to make a choice of which is the one which is the best for you, for your use case. So we've had, we'll get again into more details later, but if you look at this list of pretty common licenses, MIT, BSD, and Apache are considered permissive. When you get into LGPL, GPL, or AGPL, these are copyleft licenses. BUSL and SSPL, the OSI do not consider them as open source licenses. And then there is the differentiation between open source and open source. So we've seen in the first section that there is a real opportunity for building an open source business today, which is, it also means that there are many people who will want to jump on it and make the most of it and just use it as a checkbox, a marketing tool, the same way you're saying, oh, I am green, the same way you do greenwashing. You may call this open washing or open source. But the idea is just to check the box, I am open source, which is not necessarily very aligned with the overall open source philosophy that we just talked through from the OSI definition angle. So whether we call it open washing, open source, there are key traits which tend to be recurrent here. Basically, the code will be available. So that's basically source available, but often you have no community. No one else is building on the project beyond the group, community, company putting it out. There is barely any documentation. The code is unparsable. There is no comments, hard to understand. There is not an ecosystem of vendors. There is not an ecosystem of hosters or consultants. The license is usually very restrictive, and the open source version often ends up being completely crippled. So it's barely usable. It's almost here to say, oh, there is open source code, and all the actual useful features will end up in the proprietary fork. So not all the open washing company will have all these, check all these bullets, but that gives you a bit of an idea. If you see someone saying, oh, we are open source, but no one else is building on it, the license is very restrictive, no documentation, no ecosystem, etc., be careful. There are different players in the open source ecosystem, and three fundamental archetypes. You have the non-commercial hobby projects, where the community is mostly a group of volunteers, not doing it as a day job. So for example, Home Assistant. Then you have non-commercial professional projects, which are outside the critical business path of a given driving entity. So for example, React or Kubernetes, built by professional teams, but not monetized directly by the team. and commercial professionals project, which are where the project is itself on the critical path of a specific business. So for example, Element is one, or other companies like Nextcloud, XWiki, whatever other companies. So the focus on this lesson is very much on open source businesses. So we will focus on the latter for now, because if you're coming at it from absolutely hobbyist perspective, or an open source project used and monetized by others, it's a different story. So we're very much focusing around commercial open source. So the challenges of building an open source business. You can build an open source business from two different positions. Either you are the founding team of the project and you are trying to build the business around the project, or the project exists and you are a contributor to it and you're trying to build a business relying on an existing project. So overall, they face the same challenges, but with different emphasis. And one thing is absolutely sure, that these challenges make building an open source business even harder than a conventional one. Because you have the same hurdles than a conventional business, plus a whole bunch of new ones which are coming on top. So for example, you are building on top of a moving baseline with contributions from multiple origins that you have to corral and that you don't control. You are dependent from the project's core team. So if you're not actually the core team itself, it's harder to differentiate because you have a whole bunch of other competitors in the ecosystem, which is a good thing from a consumer customer perspective. You need to take the community into account in everything you do, and you need to decide what software that you developed is actually going into the open source domain or kept into proprietary, if you take an approach where you want to keep some of the proprietary software, some of the software proprietary. So in order to make the right decisions, you need to make sure you get the foundations right, so that then you can focus on the next level up. Understanding the real costs first. So the fact you are building on top of an open layer does not mean that you can shave off 100% of the cost of the effort of developing it. On the contrary. However, the cost profile can be different depending on whether you are building the project that you control or a project that you contribute to. But it will never be zero, that's for sure. So let's look at both situations. The first one is if you are commercializing a project that you do control. In the end, it will probably cost you more to build a real open source business on top of a project you control than a proprietary one. Because first, it means you cannot cut corners. Your code has to be impeccable because it's out there displayed in the public domain. The community is going to scrutinize you, and you need to build it in a way that others can build on top of. The second thing is that you need to review and maintain external contributions. If you have a project with an active community, they will want to help and bring new contributions, which is amazing because it means your product is evolving with resources which are not from the team, but it means that your team needs to be able to review these contributions and then maintain the contributions. The third one is that you need to support the external community as well as the user. So even if you don't pursue a business model where you need many people to build on the projects that you are commercializing, for example, if you're building an SDK, then part of your business model is to make sure that you have many people using it. Even if you don't follow that and you're putting out there a product which is fully usable, then you still need to take into account the community, interact with the community, and make sure that they are on board. And the last one is that you will need to provide some documentation on your project. It's not necessarily like the top priority, but then it makes it much easier for others, and it's basically keeping the community on board, and it takes time to write good documentation. So if you are actually building your business on a project that you do not control, so you are a contributor, part of the community, but you decide that you want to monetize it, then there are a few things which are going to increase your costs. First, you need to keep up with the changes made to the project. You don't control it, so it's going to evolve. If there is a technology change, for example, you have no control over it and you have no choice but actually adapt to it. If you contribute directly to the project, your contributions may take time to land, because on the other side, the core team is going to have to review the contribution, maintain the contributions, and accept it and iterate with you, etc. So it's not like I'm building a product, I write my code, I want to change something, I go, I update, bam, done. You have a project which is evolving, you make some changes, you need to send it to the maintenance, the core team, who is going to review and accept, etc. It slows down the whole movement. And obviously, you will hopefully want to financially support the project on top of which you are building, because you want to make sure that this project is going to be sustainable, is going to stay around, so that your business can continue to thrive on top of it. It can take different forms. Maybe this project wants to accept code contribution, or maybe they're asking for a membership, or maybe they're asking for revenue share, or it's a open core setup, a license which has copyleft, etc., etc. And it is much more expensive to build code expertise on a project that you don't control than when you are doing it on top of a project that you control. So you have to ramp up on the project itself so that you can then come in and provide support and expertise for potential customers. And then eventually there are other risks which haven't listed there, but high level, you don't have ultimate control of the security of the project, so you may have to add security requirements and reviews on top of it, steer the product direction. You don't have the control on the product direction, and you're completely dependent on the upstream project. So you need to set up a bunch of strategic control points. Before you start, you need to make sure that you are clear on the benefits you are trying to get from building an open source business. Why are you doing it? Are you doing it to check the open source box, or are you really into it? Second, what are the new constraints that building an open source business bring? For example, for real open, in particular, if you're not doing it as a marketing exercise, and if you're watching this, I hope you're not. If you want to do it really, for real, then there are a bunch of things you need to take into account. And eventually, you need to make sure you understand the additional costs which are going to come with building an open source business. In short, summarize in this lesson, so we have first agreed on the definition of open source, and we've looked at the warnings around open washing. We have looked at the challenge of building open source business and the costs that someone may ignore when they start their journey. And we've just provided a list of key questions to ask oneself before starting and getting going.